Thanks, Melissa. This microphone working? Yeah? Okay, great. First of all, just thanks to the Northern Neck 250 Coalition and to Chief Ann and the Rappahannock Tribe for hosting us here today. We really appreciate that. When I was thinking about doing this talk, a few questions came to mind for me in terms of this topic. And so this is kind of where I want to start off and sort of kind of as a jumping off point, I want to list these questions to you that I've been thinking about as it relates to the kidnapping of Pocahontas. So how do we know what we know about the kidnapping of Pocahontas? The Patawomeck community has been vilified for their role in this event for hundreds of years, even continuing until today, and even in Indigenous forums. Is it a deserved reputation? What would it look like to view this event from a Patawomeck perspective? Why can't we take these early English writings or any colonial history at face value? Why is context important to understanding history? And why must we move beyond a provincial viewpoint when examining Indigenous history, or arguably any history? The world's a big, connected, and complicated place, and all of these early documents had and have political meanings that work to further the colonial project in Wahunsenacawh. Even today, we are well aware of the political power of the written word and how words can be twisted to fit dominant narratives that marginalize or completely ignore whole groups of people. When we recognize and explore the multiple meanings of events, documents, and motivations, we can begin to read between the lines and see varied perspectives in the past and give voice and agency to people who have been ignored. So my talk today explores the primary account of the kidnapping of Pocahontas, showing how a detailed reading of a single document, really a section of a single document, can allow us to understand motivations in the past and hidden histories. I'll provide deep context on the main characters in the story, the location, the social and political context of the event, and draw on evidence beyond the written word. Ultimately, I'll provide an interpretation of this event that helps us to understand Patawomeck motivations, a Patawomeck perspective on the event, and how historical myths deriving from the colonial project are able to persist and impact communities for centuries. Now let's see if this clicker works. There we go. All right, so let's start with the story. This section that I'm going to read you, the actual section of the document, so bear with me. It's a little bit long, but I feel it's important to get the original words in here. Written by a guy named Rafe Hamer, who I'm going to talk about momentarily. And so here we go. It chanced Powhatan's delight and darling, his daughter Pocahontas, in her princely progress, if I may so term it, took some pleasure to be among her friends at Patawomeck, employed thither as shopkeepers to a fair, to exchange some of her father's commodities for theirs, where residing some 3 months or longer, it fortuned upon occasion, either of promise or profit, Captain Argyle to arrive there, whom Pocahontas, desirous to renew his familiarity with the English, and delighting to see them, as unknown, fearful perhaps to be surprised, would gladly visit, as she did, of whom no sooner had Captain Argyle intelligence, but he dealt with an old friend, an adopted brother of his, Japazaw, how and by what means he might procure her captive, assuring him that now or never was the time to pleasure him, if he intended indeed that love which he had made profession of, that in ransom of her he might redeem some of our English men in arms, now in the possession of her father, promising to use her with all fair and gentle entreaty. Japazaw, well assured that his brother, as he promised, would use her courteously, promised his best endeavors and secrecy to accomplish his desire, and thus wrought it, making his wife an instrument to effect his plot which he had thus laid. He agreed that himself, his wife, and Pocahontas would accompany his brother to the waterside. Whether come, his wife should feign a great and longing desire to go aboard and see the ship, which being there 3 or 4 times before she had never seen, and should be earnest with her husband to permit her. He seemed angry with her, making as he pretended so unnecessary a request, especially being without the company of women, which denial she, taking unkindly, must feign to weep. Whereupon her husband, seeming to pity those counterfeit tears, gave her leave to go aboard, so that it would please Pocahontas to accompany her. Now was the greatest labor to win her, guilty perhaps of her father's wrongs, though not known as she supposed to go with her, yet by her earnest persuasions she assented. So forthwith aboard they went. The best cheer that could be made was seasonably provided. To supper they went, merry on all hands, especially Japazaw and his wife, who to express their joy would e'er be treading upon Captain Argall's foot, as who should say 'tis done, she is your own. Supper ended, Pocahontas was lodged in the gunner's room, but Japazaw and his wife desired to have some conference with their brother, which was only to acquaint him by what stratagem they had betrayed his prisoner, as I have already related. After which discourse to sleep they went, Pocahontas nothing mistrusting this policy, who nevertheless, being most possessed with fear and desire of return, was first up, and hastened Japazaw to be gone. Captain Argall, having secretly well rewarded him with a small copper kettle and some less valuable toys so highly by him esteemed that doubtless he would have betrayed his own father for them, permitted both him and his wife to return, but told him that for diverse considerations, as for that his father had then 8 of our English men, many swords, pieces, and other tools, which he had at several times by treacherous murdering our men taken them, from which, though of no use to him, he would not redeliver. He would reserve Pocahontas, whereas she began to be exceeding pensive and discontented, yet ignorant of the dealing of Japazaw, who in outward appearance was no less discontented than he should be the means of her captivity. Much ado there was to persuade her to be patient, which with extraordinary courteous usage, by little and little, was wrought in her, and so to Jamestown she was brought, a messenger to her father forthwith dispatched to advertise him that his only daughter was in the hands and possession of the English, there to be kept till such time as he would ransom her with our men, swords, pieces, and other tools treacherously taken from us. The news was unwelcome and troublesome unto him, partly for the love he bare to his daughter, and partly for the love he bare to our men, his prisoners, of whom he made great use, and those swords and pieces of ours it delighted him to view and look upon. So that's a lot of confusing 17th century English. But I felt like it needed to be read so that you had the original document to see what we were going with. Okay, so let's get into understanding the context of this story. As I mentioned, the author of the account was named Rafe Hamer, and so I want to talk a little bit about who he was and kind of help us to understand where he fits into things. And of course, we don't have an actual image of Rafe Hamer, so I've put another famous Rafe up on the screen. Rafe Fiennes, for those of you who don't know him. Hamer was born around 1589 in London. He was the son of a wealthy merchant tailor, and he had a good education. He came to Virginia in 1609, but he returned to England very shortly after he arrived in Virginia, so he leaves before the starving time happens in the winter of 1609, 1610. Eventually, in 1610, he comes back to Virginia, and he ascends to the position of the Secretary of the Colony, succeeding William Strachey, who some of us know is well known for his Algonquin dictionary that he recorded. This provided Hamer with access to the official letters of the government officers for the next 4 years when he was in office. He returned to England in 1614, and he writes a true discourse of the present estate of Virginia, which is where that quote was drawn from. And he likely draws on his familiarity with those government documents to write his true discourse. His work also serves as a major source for later accounts, including John Smith's narrative, which was written in 1624. Hamer returns to Virginia again in 1617 as vice admiral with the deputy governor, Samuel Argall, whom we heard about a little bit earlier. He narrowly escaped death in 1622 during the Powhatan uprising. His brother was wounded during the uprising but wasn't killed. In the wake of the uprising, Hamer led a ship up the Potomac River to procure food and supplies, killing many of the Indians who would not trade with him, seizing their food, and then persuading the other northern groups to oppose the Powhatans. He became a member of the Virginia Council in 1625 after Virginia became a royal colony, and then he died around 1626. So that's Rafe Hamer in a nutshell. Now, let's get into the cast of characters. Arguably, the main character of the story is Pocahontas. She was born around 1596, the daughter of Powhatan, one of likely dozens of his children, given the name Matoaka. Her mother is unknown. We are not sure who she was. It wasn't recorded, at least not in any English documents. She's not really a princess, although she's often called a princess. That's not really how Powhatan society worked. And then she's also not really a diplomat, although she's referenced that way in some later writings, because that's also not really how Powhatan society and hierarchy worked. She was really more of a liaison between Powhatan and the English, although her role was not as overblown as it seems these days. Although Smith's writings suggest she played a major role in Anglo-Powhatan relations, it's likely heavily exaggerated and not quite accurate. She almost certainly did not save Smith from being killed, like the famous story goes, as an earlier letter that discusses Smith's first meeting with Powhatan doesn't even mention that episode. So it's probably something Smith came up with at a later date because it sounded good to his readers. Due to her young age, she may have tagged along with Powhatan delegations to Jamestown to perform work and learn, which was common for young women of her age. But she probably didn't participate in political or diplomatic negotiations, again, due to the structure of Powhatan society. By 1610, she marries Coquitlam, who is termed a private captain in the record, likely meaning an indigenous warrior. It's unclear exactly who or where he's from, but oral tradition and her kidnapping from Passapatanzy suggests that he may have been Potomac. This would have helped to solidify Potomac-Powhatan relationships, which both groups had been working on in the early 17th century. Of course, she's kidnapped in April 1613, as we just heard about, from Passapatanzy in Potomac territory. By 1614, almost exactly a year after she's kidnapped, she marries John Rolfe, although her consent in this union is unclear. She has a child by Rolfe, whose name was Thomas, sometime between 1615 and 1617. Again, it's murky if he's born in Virginia or if he's born overseas. We're not quite sure. In 1616, she travels to London with a Virginia Indian retinue, and she dies in Graves in England before her return in 1617. So that's a really simplified timeline of Pocahontas' life. There's a lot more out there that can be interpreted, but that's for a completely different talk. Okay, so our next character in the story, Japazaw. We don't know a lot about him. What we do know is that he was the werowance or chief at Passapatanzy and visited with Powhatan, likely on a diplomatic mission sometime around 1609, when Henry Spelman escaped Powhatan to go with Japazaw up to Passapatanzy. And Henry Spelman writes an account about his time with the Potomacs up there. Spelman lives at Passapatanzy as a guest, or maybe more better termed a hostage, of Japazaw throughout most of 1610 during the starving time. But there's really no mention in his account of any lack of food, which suggests that there are more successful harvests up in the Potomac Valley and that starvation may not have been a major concern, at least in the village of Passapatanzy. Spelman also calls Japazaw King Potomac in certain portions of his account, though in other places he says he's the brother to the Potomac werowance. So I think that underscores the English misunderstandings of hierarchy in Virginia Indian society. But I think it also raises questions of Potomac and Passapatanzy, the two places being sister towns. And then it makes us wonder which one is actually the seat of power. And is one the seat of power seasonally and the other is another seat at another season? Again, another question to explore further in a different place. Japazaw did seem to cultivate trading relationships with the English, particularly Spelman and Argall. Lots of references to trading that happened at Passapatanzy with Japazaw. And then he's also fairly well known for telling the Potomac creation story to Argall via an interpreter, and this is the only Powhatan Algonquin creation story that was recorded by the English. Can't see that. I just want to make sure we're going in the right direction here. I think we are. I couldn't see the thing. Our next character, Samuel Argall, the man who kidnaps Pocahontas. He was born around 1580 in Kent, England, the fifth son of a gentleman. So he didn't really stand to inherit a lot, considering he was the fifth son. He had a similar career and apparently a similar personality to John Smith. He was pretty boastful. He liked to exaggerate his accomplishments, and he was quick to use violence. During his younger years, he fought in the wars in the Low Countries, and he worked in the transatlantic fishing trade prior to his arrival in Virginia. So doing those two things gave him lots of experience commanding soldiers, commanding sailors, and navigating all things that were really important for people that were coming to Virginia. He first arrived in Virginia in 1609, but like Hamer, he didn't really stay that long. He left and went back to England. Then he returned in 1610, just in time to prevent the Starving Time colonists from leaving. So I don't know if you all familiar with the story of the Starving Time. As you get toward the end of the winter, in early 1610, the remaining colonists at Jamestown pack their stuff up in a boat and they get ready to leave and abandon the colony because they just couldn't take it anymore. A lot of people had died. They're on their way out and they encounter a boat, and that boat, captained by Samuel Argall, tells them, turn around, we're going back. And so they go back to Jamestown, start the colony up again. Shortly after Argall's arrival in Virginia in 1610, he begins to participate in the Anglo-Powhatan War, the first Anglo-Powhatan War, which I will talk about shortly. And he does this by burning the Werowance village and killing a lot of people that lived there. In December of 1610, he undertakes his first trading mission to Passapatanzy for food and furs, and that's where he first meets Japazaw. And then during the first half of 1613, he trades and wanders in the Potomac River Valley and the northern Chesapeake area. And of course, by April of 1613, he kidnaps Pocahontas. That's not where it ends for Argall, though. He goes on to aid in negotiating peace with the Pamunkey and the Chickahominy tribes in March and April of 1614, which really helps to bring an end to the First Anglo-Powhatan War. And that Chickahominy peace is recorded by Rafe Hamer in his account that also talks about Pocahontas' kidnapping. And I want to read a little section of that to give you an idea of what this peace treaty was kind of like. But also, when he negotiates this peace, it's important to note that Argall arrives at the meeting place with the Chickahominies on an armed frigate and a barge with 50 men who are also armed. And so the English were able to extract these terms from the Chickahominies, and quote here. First, they should take upon them, as they promised, the name of Tassintassus, or Englishmen, and be King James his subjects, and be forever honest, faithful, and trusty unto his deputy in their country. Secondly, that they should never kill any of our men or cattle, but if either of our men or cattle should offend them or run to them, they should bring them home again, and should receive satisfaction for the trespass done them. Thirdly, they should at all times be ready and willing to furnish us with 300 or 400 bowmen to aid us against the Spaniards, whose name is odious amongst them. For Powhatan's father was driven by them from the West Indies into those parts, or against any other Indians which should, contrary to the established peace, offer us any injury. Fourthly, they shall not upon any occasion whatsoever break down any of our pales, or come into any of our towns or forts by any other ways, issues or ports than ordinary, but first call and say that Tassintassus are there. And so coming, they shall be at all times let in and kindly entertained. Fifthly, so many fighting men as they have, which may be at least 500, should yearly bring into our storehouse at the beginning of their harvest 2 bushels of corn a man, as tribute of their obedience to his majesty and to his deputy there, for which they should receive so many iron tomahawks or small hatchets. Lastly, the 8 chief men which govern as substitutes and counselors under Sir Thomas Dale shall at all times see these articles and conditions duly performed, for which they shall receive a red coat or livery from our king yearly, and each of them the picture of his majesty engraven in copper, with a chain of copper to hang it about his neck, whereby they shall be known to be King James his noble men. So as if these conditions or any of them be broken, the offenders themselves shall not only be punished, but also those commanders, because they stand engaged for them. End quote. Not great terms for the Chickahominies, really. Argall then goes on to command the ship. I think I mentioned that Rafe Hamer comes back in 1617 to Virginia. Argall commands that ship, and that was the ship that was supposed to bring Pocahontas back from England. Argall also commanded the ship that brought Pocahontas to England. So Argall's got a real obsession with Pocahontas. As I noted, Argall returns to Virginia in 1617, serves as deputy governor until 1619. Then he returns to England and serves as an agent of colonialism in other parts of the Atlantic until his death at sea in 1626. All right, so we've got our main characters. Let's examine the place. Passapatanzy, a Potomac village located on the south side of Potomac Creek in modern-day King George, across from and within sight of the ancestral Potomac village at Indian Point and Marlborough Point. 44 ST2 is the archaeological site number for the ancestral village. The site appears to show up in John Smith's map with the name Matacount associated with it. It's marked by one of the red arrows on there. Or an alternative to that could be that perhaps the word Potomac stretches across Potomac Creek, may help support this idea of sister villages between Potomac Creek. You know, you've got Passapatanzy on one side and ST2 or ST1 on the other side. You see this in the lower Rappahannock Valley with the Rappahannock tribe. There are villages that stretch across the river. There's no reason to think that this wasn't something that happened in other parts of the Algonquin world. Passapatanzy was the location of many recorded interactions with the English in the early 1600s, and Japazaw appears to have been the werowance at that village during the early decades of that century. Henry Spelman, as I mentioned, the young English boy, stayed at Passapatanzy for a year and wrote an account of his time with the Potomac people. And it was also likely the last occupied major village for the Potomac people in the middle and late 1600s. The name still persists on the landscape in King George, though settlement patterns have become more focused on roadways rather than waterways, so Passapatanzy is actually now just kind of a crossroads along 218. And important to note here, the archaeological site of Passapatanzy has not yet been positively identified, but more than likely somewhere on the southern shore of Potomac Creek, upstream of Fairview Beach. There we go. Okay. So now I want to move on to sort of the major setting and overarching political event that framed the kidnapping of Pocahontas, and that's the First Anglo-Powhatan War. This event occurred from 1609 to 1614, and it's really less of a sustained war as we think of them today, rather more a series of raids and counter-raids stemming primarily from poor planning on the part of the English in relation to food production, food procurement, and a general lack of diplomacy, combined with encroachment on Powhatan lands and poor leadership among the English. Who does it begin under? John Smith, that famous English leader. Of course, violent conflict began in 1609 when Smith sent two groups of men to live off the land because he felt like the fort couldn't support everybody. And one of these groups went on to attack and burn a Nansemond village. Not only did they kill Nansemond people and burn the village, they also desecrated burials and Nansemond temples. Of course, the Nansemonds weren't happy about that, and they retaliated, killing half of the Englishmen in that group. It was during that time that Henry Spelman was sent as a hostage to Powhatan with some others to ensure a tenuous peace between the English and Powhatan groups in 1609. So that was a common thing to exchange hostages as a way to make sure that everybody held up their end of the bargain. So that's what was going on when Spelman first went with Powhatan. Powhatan ordered trade to the English at James Fort cut off in 1609, and that led to what we know as the starving time in the winter of 1609-1610. The English gentlemen weren't great at growing their own crops, and Powhatan decided that he didn't need to give them any more of his food. So this Powhatan strategy almost succeeded. As I noted, the English had packed their stuff up and they were sailing out when Samuel Argall arrived in 1610 and told them to turn around. This was probably the closest that Virginia Indians got to expelling the English after they came here in 1607. After Argall gets there, the English began to use terror tactics that they had learned and perfected in Ireland, including random killings of Virginia Indians, the rampant burning of villages, the destruction of food stores, deception, murdering captives, all the things that were almost unheard of in Virginia Indian culture. That's not really how war was conducted among Virginia Indians. This back and forth continued between the English and the Virginia Indians until Pocahontas was kidnapped, and she marries John Rolfe in 1614, along with the treaties between the Chickahominy and the Pamunkey and the English, and all those things concluded the First Anglo-Powhatan War approximately a year after she was kidnapped from Passapatanzy. Okay. So to this point, we've largely focused on sort of the larger historical and contextual processes, as well as individuals in the region and related to this story of Pocahontas' kidnapping. But now we also need to understand the role of the Potomac's in particular in Senacomico and beyond in order to see and help to understand a Potomac perspective on the event. So to do that, we first have to go back centuries prior to the arrival of Europeans. The Potomacs, or at least the group that Smith encountered, were the result of a movement and combination of groups of people starting around 1300 AD. Termed the Potomac Creek Complex by archaeologists, these people shared cultural traits that encompassed most of northern Virginia, the western shore of Maryland, the upper reaches of the northern neck, and areas around the Rappahannock Falls. In that image, it kind of shows the extent of the Potomac Creek Complex, so that's where all these culture-related people are living. Palisaded villages, like the one at 44 ST2 on Marlborough Point, were established around this time, around 1300, and Piscataway oral history recorded in the 1600s by the Maryland government attests that the Potomacs and Piscataways in Maryland were allied prior to the arrival of the English. The alliance made the Potomacs part of a highly influential political group in the region until it dissolved on the eve of English colonization. Despite the end of the alliance, the Potomacs remained a powerful group, with Smith noting at least 160 bowmen, which equates to approximately 800 people, and it was one of the larger groups that was counted by Smith. The Potomacs also maintained far-flung networks of alliance through trade, and I'll address that momentarily. Somebody is not having a good day today. The geographic distance from the heart of Powhatan territory and Jamestown also provided some insulation from both the early impact of English colonialism and Powhatan's expansion in the years leading up to that for the Potomac people. Nevertheless, Powhatan sought to maintain relationships with the Potomacs, as early English records indicate diplomatic missions, tribute, and other types of interaction with the Potomacs being able to maneuver to maintain their own political autonomy and sovereignty. That maintenance of autonomy is highlighted by episodes like Spelman's escape to Passapatanzy and the willingness of the Potomacs to trade with the English when the core Powhatan groups would not. Nevertheless, the relationship between the core Powhatan groups and the Potomacs does not seem to have turned violent. Rather, political maneuvering was accomplished through alliance and economic networks. In addition to the geographic distance from Jamestown and the core Powhatan area, the aspect of Potomac culture that most allowed for their political autonomy and maneuvering during the early decades of the 17th century was their keen ability to form vast trading networks. The word Potomac roughly translates to bring together they go and come, or trading place. The name that John Smith recorded for the location of the village along Potomac Creek, and by extension, correctly or incorrectly for the people living there, highlights the centrality of exchange to Potomac culture. The highly developed trade networks of the Potomac people before the arrival of Europeans are well known to archaeologists, with objects and materials that made their way to Potomac Creek from places as far away as the Gulf Coast, Eastern Shore, and the Northeast. When John Smith sailed up Potomac Creek in 1608, he encountered a highly developed nexus of exchange. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that the majority of English accounts related to Potomac people in those early decades of the 1600s center around trade. Corn and furs figure most prominently, as the English found a willing and somewhat reliable supplier of both in the Potomacs. However, Smith also highlights the role of the mineral antimony in Potomac trading networks that stretch to the interior of the country. Partially because of this experience, it was easy to represent the kidnapping of Pocahontas by Argyle as yet another trade interaction, exchanging a small copper kettle and some other less valuable toys for the daughter of Powhatan, and make it sound believable for hundreds of years. So why did Hamer and the English tell the story of Pocahontas' kidnapping the way they did? What reasons would they have had to represent things a certain way? First and foremost, it's important to understand that there were major cultural boundaries between the English and Virginia Indians that were still being worked out in those first decades of the 17th century. Even something as seemingly straightforward to us as the exchange of goods was highly complex in Virginia Indian culture and led to many conflicts and misunderstandings. And if you want to read more about that, I would highly recommend Seth Mallios's book, The Deadly Politics of Giving. Maybe Hamer and everybody else just misunderstood the meaning behind the event. After all, the exchange of hostages was a common practice between Algonquin groups as a way of cementing peaceful relationships. Henry Spelman is an example. If this was the case, the English should have provided a hostage to the Patamocks, and it appears that they didn't. Another way to think about Hamer's motivation in his story is to understand that many of these published accounts were created with the sole purpose of attracting colonists to Virginia. They were like advertisements. Yes, they needed to provide the potential colonizer with some background information on the local geography and people, but most of all, they needed to make it sound like everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about if one decided to cross the Atlantic. Hamer was present in Virginia for the majority of the First Anglo-Powhatan War, yet his account speaks little of the violence associated with it or the exceedingly precarious position of the English, particularly at the end of the starving time. Wouldn't want to scare the tourists away. Overall, as you might expect, his account speaks to the adept political maneuvering of the English and playing groups of Virginia Indians off of one another to support English designs. He also highlights the luck, or maybe it was divine intervention, in events breaking toward the English, underlining the divine nature of the colonizing mission. He's even able to fit in some digs at the Chickahominies in relation to their peace agreement when he puts these words into their mouths. Quote, "For this they did chiefly insist upon, that he, Powhatan, was an ill werowance, full of cruelty and injustice, covetous of those things they had, and implacable if they denied him whatsoever he demanded. And for these reasons desired to be made one people with us, to curb the pride and ambition of Powhatan, from whom to defend them, they told us it would be no breach of peace on our parts, since now they were no longer Chickahominies or naturals of that place, but Tosintassus, and King James his subjects." If one's to believe Hamer's account wholeheartedly, then we must accept English superiority in every aspect. They are more politically savvy compared to the childish Indians, greater warriors, and divinely ordained to conquer these lands. Even the Indians don't want to be Indians. They want to be English. With the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe, peace rules in Virginia. Why not come and make your fortune with all that free land? For if God is with them, who could be against them? Of course, we know from other accounts and from the archaeology that Virginia was not a pleasant place for Englishmen in the early 17th century. Starvation was real, disease was rampant, violence was ever present, and English domination was not a foregone conclusion. The portrayal of Pocahontas in this story of her kidnapping, in addition to her role in other events, arguably plays into a literary trope familiar to educated Englishmen of the period, underscoring the semi-fictitious or exaggerated nature of the work. Specifically here, I'm referencing bride kidnapping and its role in ending wars. The theme dates back in Western literature to at least the time of Homer's Iliad, but's perhaps best remembered in the mythological account of the rape of the Sabine women during the early days of Rome under the reign of Romulus, as a strategy for growing Roman strength and incorporating Latin tribes into Rome. For those not as familiar with the classics, you probably know Seven Brides for Seven Brothers. I'll let you know a little secret here. The people that go and steal women and force them into marriage are not the good guys. The Roman historian Livy's account of the events related to the abduction of the Sabine women goes like this, quote, "The Sabine women, from the outrage on whom the war originated, with hair disheveled and garments rent, the timidity of their sex being overcome by such dreadful scenes, had the courage to throw themselves amid the flying weapons and make a rush across, to part the incensed armies and assuage their fury, imploring their fathers on the one side, their husbands on the other, that as fathers-in-law and sons-in-law, they would not contaminate each other with impious blood, nor stain their offspring with parricide, the one their grandchildren, the other their children. If you are dissatisfied with the affinity between you, if with our marriages turn your resentment against us, we are the cause of this war, we of wounds and of bloodshed to our husbands and parents. It were better that we perish than live widowed or fatherless without one or other of you. Remember this, John Smith's account of Pocahontas saving him is written after Hamer's story is told. People reading this account would have seen the parallels. In England, wealthier sorts like Hamer and Argyll would have been educated in classical mythology and Roman history. They would have been very familiar with the rape of the Sabine women. The poorer sort would have been familiar with plays, many of which drew on Roman history. Indeed, Shakespeare's Roman histories, Coriolanus, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and Titus Andronicus, were all first performed between about 1590 and 1608. And of course, he wasn't the only playwright in early modern England that people were seeing. Obviously, there's no record written from a Potomac perspective on the event. So like much of Virginia Indian history, we have to read between the lines. That's why I've spent most of the time here talking about the background and context for this very small passage. First, we have to assume that the kidnapping of Pocahontas occurred in some way similar to what Hamer described. I think that's certainly an assumption. But if we forego some of the details, I think we can agree that a few things are at least approaching accuracy. Pocahontas was at Passapatanzy, according to Hamer, to exchange some of Powhatan's commodities. And there's that trade thing again. Japazaw had a pre-existing relationship with Argyll. Argyll anchors his ship off the village at Passapatanzy and through some means is able to extract Pocahontas from the Potomacs. As I mentioned, it's quite possible that the Potomacs could have viewed this as a hostage exchange related to peace negotiations, though perhaps deceived by not receiving anybody in exchange. It seems unlikely that the Potomacs would have given up Powhatan's daughter when they were clearly cultivating economic and political relationships with him. Trading corn to strangers when you've been advised against it is very different from aiding in the kidnapping of a werowance's daughter from both an economic and political perspective. With this in mind, perhaps Japazaw was coerced by Argyll to give Pocahontas up. Hamer's account certainly doesn't offer too much evidence to that effect, but luckily, we've got one more source to examine. So the original 1615 publication of Hamer's account didn't include any illustrations. However, a 1617 version printed in German did include engravings that were later copied by de Bry in 1624. These weren't drawn by Hamer, it's important to note that, but it does provide a clear picture of European attitudes toward Virginia Indians. So let's talk about the engraving a little bit. So first of all, Japazaw's on the left, he's holding the copper kettle. He's depicted as some kind of devil or demon. Look at the feathers, they represent horns. He's wearing a tail. Perhaps that hints at his role as a betrayer, a 4-century-old reputation. The action in the background of the engraving, I think, speaks more to the reality of the situation and the choices Japazaw had to make when Argyll rode into Potomac Creek in April of 1613. Clearly, a village is being attacked and burned by Argyll's henchmen. While this may not have happened during this specific event, Argyll's reputation as a murderer and destroyer of villages would have been well known to Japazaw by the time he came looking for Pocahontas. Remember that he had burned the Werowance village shortly after his arrival to Virginia in 1610. And additionally, the other atrocities being committed by the English, including attacking under false banners of truce, desecrating burials, and murdering women and children, would have been well known. Japazaw and the Potomacs didn't live in a bubble. Their relationship with the core Powhatan groups and their extensive trade networks brought news to them quickly, and all this context would have figured into the decisions Japazaw made surrounding the kidnapping of Pocahontas. Explicitly or implicitly, Argyll's arrival in Potomac Creek with a ship, men, and guns demanding Pocahontas provided the Patomac werowance with two choices. He could deny Argyll's request and see his village burned and people killed, if not during this expedition, then in a later date, or he could just not stand in Argyll's way and preserve the lives and homes of his people. Despite the previous actions of the English, Japazaw assumed that Pocahontas was too valuable of a bargaining chip to be killed, and he wagered that she would remain relatively safe. Faced with a nearly impossible choice, Japazaw made a calculated decision to preserve the lives and livelihoods of those within his community. Because of that choice, the English records have vilified him, painting him as a traitor to his own people, and serving to perpetuate the myth of the sale of Pocahontas through colonial propaganda for centuries. But I ask you this, what would you have done in that situation? Ultimately, the uncritical reading of these early colonial stories has only served to further a colonial project that seeks to turn people who should stand united against one another and to paint people as others who are less than the dominant culture. If a single short section of a colonial record can hold so much meaning and information when put into the context of its time and place and examined from an Indigenous perspective, then imagine what we could see if we opened our eyes to the other histories hiding in the stories we have told ourselves. Thank you.